The 2025 NFL Draft is just around the corner, and that means the 2025 Dynasty fantasy football season is absolutely starting to kick off. We have rookie drafts coming up. We have startup drafts coming up as well. So what I want to do in today's video is break down 5 wide receivers that I think you should be targeting in your Dynasty leagues that you need to try and trade for before it's too late. All right, so I want to kick the video off with Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. And Garrett Wilson is really one of these players that I'm starting to see pop up in a lot of trades, and I just feel like he's being completely undervalued. And I understand that it was a bit of a disappointing season last year, I guess, but when you really break it down, to me, it was not. I mean, he averaged 14.8 fantasy points per game, still had a great season overall, finishing as a top 15 wide receiver in fantasy football with over 1,100 receiving yards and 7 receiving touchdowns, 154 targets, and 101 receptions on the season. And don't forget, that was with Davante Adams joining the Jets and taking away a lot of volume, especially volume in the red zone as the season started to conclude. But we all went into the season with the idea that a healthy Aaron Rodgers was going to lead to one of Garrett Wilson's best seasons. And statistically, this past season was Garrett Wilson's best overall season. So I don't really understand why his perceived value in a lot of dynasty leagues out there has kind of dropped when he has improved in every measure statistically this last season, right? So we still look at his career as a whole. While it's been a tad bit underwhelming to some fantasy managers at times, he still has finished with over 1,000 receiving yards and 83 receptions in each of his 3 seasons so far. Now, the big question for Garrett Wilson and owners of Garrett Wilson in dynasty leagues is, who in the world is going to be the New York Jets starting quarterback this season? We know it's not going to be Aaron Rodgers. We know that Davante Adams is likely out the door as well at the wide receiver position. So what exactly is this offense going to be? Are they going to go out and draft a rookie quarterback this season? Are they going to bring in a bridge quarterback who's out there on the free agent market? It's tough to say, but what Garrett Wilson has proven throughout his career so far is that he can produce as a viable flex option or wide receiver 3 option in fantasy football with bad quarterbacks. And I really think at the end of the day, he's been a true model of consistency. He has played 17 games in each of the last 3 seasons. And like I said, the quarterback just hasn't really mattered. Does he bring that extreme upside to the table? No, not really. And part of that is because of the quarterback play that he has had over the last 3 seasons. But once again, when we're playing in these dynasty formats, you need a wide receiver 3. You need more than one reliable flex option. And Garrett Wilson can certainly be that in full PPR format. So overall, I feel like in a lot of trades I'm seeing out there in dynasty communities, his value has been a little bit underappreciated. And I think at the end of the day, he is a great trade target. And especially if the Jets do go out and draft a rookie quarterback who has some upside, like a Shedeur Sanders, or a player that is going to maybe help rise Garrett Wilson's stock, maybe one of those bridge quarterbacks that's out there on the market that some fantasy managers might be higher on, then I do think we could see Garrett Wilson kind of get back to being a player who's a little bit more difficult to trade for. So right now, I think is the perfect time to go out and trade for Garrett Wilson. I would absolutely do so. I think he's going to have another very productive season in 2025. Moving along, I want to take a look at Jackson Smith and Jigba, who definitely has seen some rise perceived value when it comes to dynasty formats, having what you could call a breakout sophomore season after a disappointing rookie season. In his rookie season, he finished as the wide receiver 48 in full PPR formats. This past season, one spot below Garrett Wilson, finishing as the wide receiver 14 in full PPR formats. Finished the season with over 1,100 receiving yards off of 100 receptions, 137 targets, and 6 total touchdowns on the season, averaging 14.9 fantasy points per game. Was extremely consistent this past season. He ended up having single-digit performances just 4 times on the season as a whole. So this is one of those players that you could throw into the flex and always rely on, right? But I think the thing that's really interesting right now for me when it comes to Jackson Smith and Jigba, while I like him really regardless of the circumstances next year, what I think is interesting is that we're starting to get some rumors surfacing that DK Metcalf could be on the trade block, is one of the names that's popping up as a potential draft day candidate to be traded to another team. It's that time of year, though. That could be complete smoke and mirrors. Who knows? But that would obviously open up a ton of more targets for Jackson Smith and Jigba going into the 2025 season. But if DK Metcalf is still on the Seahawks going into next season, which I also think is very likely, right, then that does not bother me whatsoever, because obviously that defensive pressure is going to be a bit alleviated when both DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and Jigba are both on the field. But obviously DK Metcalf dealt with some injuries this past season, and we got to see games where Jackson Smith and Jigba was the wide receiver 1 for the Seahawks, and games where he lined up as the wide receiver 2. And regardless, he still gave us a ton of production. Don't forget, I mean, it's so easy to forget that going into the 2023 fantasy football season, JSN was the wide receiver 1, across all Dynasty format rankings, right? And then just kind of came in, wasn't the best situation for him in that rookie season. Play calling was a bit off, wasn't utilized, whatever it was. He still saw plenty of flashes. I mean, he averaged 9.97 yards per catch in his rookie season. But regardless, it was definitely disappointing based on his ADP in rookie drafts and startup drafts going into 2023. And like I said, this past year, he had that kind of breakout sophomore season. But like I said, we could be looking at JSN potentially lining up as a true wide receiver 1 going into 2025 if DK Metcalf does truly get traded this offseason, which, like I said, could be complete smoke and mirrors. And that's going to open up a ton of volume for JSN going into 2025. But like I said, even if it doesn't, I think that JSN is still a great trade candidate who's going to have a lot of consistency over the next couple of seasons, a player that you can rely in the flex. And what we saw last year is that JSN does have a good amount of upside. The bigger question here long term is who's going to be the quarterback moving forward for the Seattle Seahawks. I think Geno Smith is kind of in a make or break it season this year. I think the Seahawks as a whole could kind of be in that category, right? So we'll see what happens at the quarterback position moving forward with JSN, but I think ultimately right now is still a good time to go out and trade for him. I don't know that his trade value is completely undermined right now, but ultimately I think that JSN is going to have a ton of production for the next couple years. So go ahead and get him while he's still kind of in that area where he's had one kind of poor season under his belt, then a great season this past year. I think that a lot of that production is going to be a consistent thing moving forward. Ultimately, I think now is the time to go ahead and trade for him before we get more and more seasons under the belt of consistency, and that's going to just make it even more difficult to trade for JSN. And speaking of disappointing rookie seasons at the wide receiver position, let's take a look at Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals, who is another player that I absolutely think you guys should go out and trade for, and is a player that I'm seeing involved in a lot of trades where his overall fantasy value in terms of the dynasty community is being completely overlooked. Like, people are just looking at last year's rookie season, where they drafted him, and they're like done with Marvin Harrison Jr. And I think JSN is a really good example of why you should not be done with Marvin Harrison Jr. And when we break it down, it was an extremely disappointing rookie season, finishing as the wide receiver 26 in fantasy football this past year. And based on his ADP, right, whether you were in a redraft league where you got him at the end of the first, or whether you were in a rookie or startup draft where you spent high draft capital on him, that was disappointing, especially looking at the player that he was coming out of college, right? But I mean, at the end of the day, 116 targets, 62 receptions, 885 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, 14.2 yards per catch. There are a lot of bumps in the road, a lot of inconsistency here. How much of that had to do with the offense as a whole, the play calling, Kyler Murray at quarterback? It's hard to say, right? But really, we expected a lot more out of Marvin Harrison Jr. in his rookie season. And just as a whole, being included in this offense, I mean, like, we obviously have Trey McBride at tight end, taking a lot of volume. The run game was great behind James Conner this past year. But other than that, I mean, there were no real threats in terms of the volume production at the wide receiver position, overall targets that should have taken away from Marvin Harrison Jr. So just a very disappointing season for Marvin Harrison, but I think moving forward, that's going to be fixed. He's still the true number one wide receiver in this offense. Of course, that could change through the draft, through free agency. They can go out and draft another wide receiver, trade for one, sign free agent, whatever it's going to be. But I don't think that's going to change the fact that he's the true number one wide receiver in the Cardinals offense. So I'm going to look at this rookie season, and while it was disappointing based on ADP and all that stuff, I'm not going to overreact here. I think he is a great player to go out and trade for. I am seeing trades where Marvin Harrison Jr. is just like a cherry on top that fantasy managers just don't care about. Now, obviously, that's not going to account for all you guys out there. A lot of you guys are going to be a lot more patient with this process, right? And that's what you absolutely need to do in dynasty formats. But you have to remember there's a lot of leagues out there. Dynasty formats are getting more and more popular year by year. And there are a lot of fantasy managers who want that instant production, especially if they believe that their team is a contender right now. So for me, regardless of if you are a contender or if you are playing the long game here, Marvin Harrison Jr. is a great player to go out and trade for. I think he also fits into that category. At the very worst, you're looking at a consistent wide receiver 3 flex option. And once again, in dynasty formats, a lot of you guys out there need those flex options and that depth at wide receiver, one of the most important things for a lot of dynasty formats out there. So bottom line, I think that he is a great trade candidate because he's being completely undervalued in terms of what you need to give up to go out and get him. At the end of the day, he's going to have a very productive career, in my personal opinion. So Marvin Harrison Jr. is out there on the trade block, and even if he's not, go out and make some offers for him because I think there are a lot of fantasy managers out there who are willing to move Marvin Harrison Jr. at this given moment. All right, next up, I want to take a look at another Ohio State wide receiver, and that's going to be Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. And look, there's plenty of reason to have hesitation around Chris Olave, trying to add him to your dynasty roster. I totally understand that, right? One more concussion, and I don't know what we're going to be looking at when it comes to Chris Olave's future, but we've also seen kind of this concussion scare with other players in most recent memory, Tua Tagovailoa, and then it ends up to kind of be a nothing burger. And I'm not, downplaying the seriousness of concussions and what it means for NFL players, but sometimes we have a season or two where there is a string of concussions. And I think Chris Olave handled this past season very well by basically saying, I'm not going back out there, especially with the state of this team and this offense and who's playing at quarterback and all of that. But at the end of the day, I think that Chris Olave is going to be good to go for the 2025 season. If he suffers concussion, then obviously we're starting to play with fire. But at the end of the day, he might not suffer any concussions in 2025, and he's been extremely consistent in the first 2 seasons of his career. The third season was not playing too bad through 8 games before he exited for the rest of the season, right? But in the first 2 seasons of his career, over 1,000 receiving yards, at least 4 touchdowns, and at least 72 catches, as well as 12.91 yards per catch in those first 2 seasons. You look back to this last year, through 8 games, 32 receptions, 44 targets, 400 receiving yards, 12.5 yards per catch, and unfortunately just 1 single receiving touchdown. But once again, the Saints had a very bumpy season. I know through the first 2 weeks of the season, they were one of the best offenses in the league last year. Crazy to think about, but that's true, right? Then after that, it was just a very bumpy road. We saw different quarterbacks, Spencer Rattler, all kinds of stuff, all kinds of injuries on this team. So let's just mark it up as a poor season for the Saints, and let's move forward. We're heading into 2025. 2024 is a great sample size, but truly, it doesn't really matter, right? So I think that Chris Olave is a player who you don't have to give up a lot of trade capital for, a lot of draft capital for. And I think he's worth the risk because we've seen that consistency through the first 2 seasons of his career, and even through 8 games last year was not as bad, especially with the state of the Saints last year, right? So Chris Olave, bottom line for me, one thing I always look for in trades, whether it's during the season or in the off season, is what kind of variables are leading to a very cheap trade that could pay off. And right now, Chris Olave is in a great spot if we're trying to go out and trade for players. I've seen a lot of trades out there where Chris Olave is just kind of thrown into the mix as like, here you go, whatever. I don't care about this player anymore. And when it comes to Dynasty, especially, once again, when wide receiver is so very important to the build and the structure of Dynasty teams, when we're playing a lot of formats with 3 wide receivers and multiple flex formats, you got to have depth, right? And this is a player that I would not mind whatsoever being on my bench right now. And at the end of the day, you have to kind of make that decision. I don't want to play with fire. I don't want to touch Chris Olave. I'm personally worried about the concussions. That's completely fine. I respect it. But personally, if you're looking for good trade options, I'm in the boat right now where I am willing to take the risk on Chris Olave as a player. And at the end of the day, if I'm not giving up a lot of trade capital, he ends up being a player who's on my bench. I am completely okay with that. So right now, I don't think there's going to be a better time to go out and acquire Chris Olave. And we may be kind of sitting in this boat throughout the entirety of the offseason. So let's take advantage of it. I think Chris Olave is a great player to take a chance on and to trade for right now in your dynasty leagues. All right, last but not least, I want to talk about Jalen McMillan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Coming off of a rookie season where he had 461 receiving yards off of 37 catches, 58 targets, and 8 receiving touchdowns. Now, he finished as the wide receiver 55. Nothing crazy here, but we're not looking at the entirety of the season. What we really want to look at are weeks 14 through 18 and then what he did through the NFL playoffs, right? And at the end of the day, Jalen McMillan was a huge part of the Buccaneers offense. We look between weeks 14 and 18, he had 16.7 or more fantasy points in all those games. I know week 18 doesn't matter for majority of us in the fantasy community, but he still showed plenty of production. And I mean, in that stretch, he had at least 1 touchdown in each of those games. He just really became a big part of this offense and a target that Baker Mayfield had full trust in. Now, the elephant in the room, right? We know Mike Evans going to play next year, and we know that Chris Godwin is going to be coming back from that leg injury. And that kind of leaves a question. There are a lot of, reports out there that the Buccaneers are going to try to re-sign Chris Godwin, keep him with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But we'll have to see what kind of plays out there. Does Chris Godwin end up on a different team? That's obviously a good thing for Jalen McMillan, going to just kind of solidify him as a wide receiver 2 on this team. But what happens if Chris Godwin is a Tampa Bay Buccaneer in 2025? I'm personally not crazy worried about it. I do think that Chris Godwin, even though he's coming back from a serious injury, will line up as a wide receiver 2. He's far too talented to not be the wide receiver 2 on this team. But this is a pass-heavy offense. I know that the Buccaneers offensive coordinator is once again left and is now, head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars, just like the year before. Dave Canales left, became head coach of the Panthers. But at the end of the day, I still think that this offense has to run through what Baker Mayfield can do. I know we have great running backs here with Bucky Irving and my guy Rashad White. But at the end of the day, right, I think that this offense boils down to its passing game. We'll see how things shake out this year. And there are plenty of offenses out there that can get involvement from 3 wide receivers. Plus, you have to always kind of think forward and what kind of variables are going to show up throughout this season. You have a veteran wide receiver in Mike Evans who had the hamstring injury last year. Then you have a veteran wide receiver in Chris Godwin, potentially coming back to the Buccaneers coming off of a serious injury. Those 2 guys, of course, could miss time in the 2025 season. Then the youngest player here with the least amount of injury history is going to be Jalen McMillan. So I think right now is a really good time to go out and try and add him to your dynasty rosters, because we had this looming question of, some people are in the boat that Chris Godwin's going to be back, so they have a lower perceived value of Jalen McMillan. And then some fantasy managers don't really care either way, or they think that Chris Godwin is not going to be back, and that's going to open up a lot of opportunity for Jalen McMillan, so their perceived value is a bit higher. So if you're in a league where the fantasy manager who owns McMillan is a little bit lower on him right now, this is a great time to go out and trade for him. And for me personally, with what we saw last year out of McMillan at the end of the season, I'm not really concerned about if Chris Godwin is back with the Bucs or not. I just think that McMillan is going to be a big part of this offense either way. I think that right now is the perfect time to go out and trade for Jalen McMillan in your dynasty leagues before it's too late. That'll do it for today's video. There are 5 wide receivers that I think you guys need to try and go out and trade for in your dynasty leagues before it's too late. As always, guys, I'll answer every single comment on this video. If you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, please drop them down below. I'll get back to each of you guys when I can. And as always, if you guys are new to the channel, we do redraft, dynasty, and best ball content all year round here on the channel. So make sure that you guys hit that subscribe button on the way out. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.